Well, as we continue our study of Genesis 49, which is essentially a series of prophetic blessings that predestines the character and the attributes of the 12 tribes of Israel, we ended last time with the fourth-born son of Jacob, which is Judah. And we saw that Judah seemingly received the firstborn blessing. However, what Judah actually received was just a portion of the firstborn blessing, which was the right to rule. Now, we saw that the firstborn blessing consists of two fundamental elements: the right to rule and the right to inherit a double portion of the tribe's wealth. So the receiver of the firstborn blessing typically became the richest member of his tribe. At the same moment, he became that tribe's ruling authority. But that is not what happened with this blessing by Jacob. Instead, in a biblically unique event, Jacob split that firstborn blessing, giving the right to rule to the tribe of Judah, giving the double portion to Joseph, but to Joseph tribally, that meant by means of his two sons, Ephraim and Manasseh. Now, just so that we're clear about what I mean about Joseph receiving the double portion by means of his two sons, at this moment in history, the authority and the essence of Joseph's tribe was placed into the hands of his two sons, Ephraim and Manasseh. Because in the cross-handed blessing, Jacob had adopted Ephraim and Manasseh away from Joseph, made them his own sons. So Ephraim and Manasseh each received a portion, an equal share of the wealth of Israel, just like all their new brothers, Reuben, Simeon, Levi, and all the other 12 tribes. Since Ephraim and Manasseh would, from this point forward, represent the tribe of Joseph, and since they each held a full share of Israel's wealth, the tribe of Joseph, therefore, held 2 shares of Israel's wealth, a double portion. When we get to Joseph in this series of blessings, we're going to find another expression used to describe the double portion part of the firstborn blessing, and it is fruitfulness and increase. So, open your Bibles to Genesis chapter 49, and we'll continue on with these blessings. If you have a complete Jewish Bible, we're going to look at page 57. Genesis 49. We're going to just look at 3 verses here to start with, and that'll be verses 13, 14, and 15. Genesis 49, verse 13. Zebulun will live at the seashore, with ships anchoring along his coast and his border at Sidon. Issachar as a strong donkey, lying down in the sheep sheds. On seeing how good is settled life, how pleasant the country, he will bend his back to the burden and submit to forced labor. What we see here is that it is said that Zebulun's destiny is to be in commercial ventures. He'll be a merchant and a trader. And hundreds of years into the future, we'll find that Zebulun's territorial allotment will put them as a land bridge between the Sea of Galilee and the Mediterranean Sea. They never really possessed territory all the way to the seashore, but they had shipping and trading interests on both seas. But more directly through their territory ran one of the greatest trading routes of that era or any other, the Via Maris, the way of the sea. It began in Damascus, Syria. It wound its way all the way down eventually to Egypt. And it was an enormous economic boon for the tribe of Zebulun to have that trade route go through their territory. Now, just as Zebulun's blessing is short and sweet, so is the tribe's biblical history. Very little is said about Zebulun. No person of significance is mentioned as coming from the tribe of Zebulun. However, in the song of Deborah and Barak, Zebulun is mentioned as being one of several tribes that committed many men to fighting against the king of Hatzor in the valley of Jezreel, which, by the way, is in Zebulun's territory. Now, though precious little is said in the Bible about Zebulun, what is said could I think, be characterized as positive and complimentary towards them. Now, even less is known about Issachar than his brother Zebulun. In fact, so little is known about Issachar that the ancient Israelite scholars went out of their way to invent good things to say about his descendants. Now, primarily it is that while the ancestors of Zebulun toiled away as merchants, it was to support the tribe of Issachar because they were great Torah scholars. Now, this is pretty easy to debunk as simply a self-serving fable, because after Babylon, when the vast amount of rabbinical writings and rulings and commentary was created, this is when the tradition was created that Torah study was now the highest calling of any Jew. Conversely, being a merchant, being absorbed with dealing with the material matters of trade and money, this was the lowest calling. So the notion that the merchant tribe would be the supporters of the tribe of learned Torah scholars was quite an ideal. And it fit in very well with the social agenda of the Jewish post-Babylon exile time, when these legends and traditions concerning Issachar and Zebulun were created. Now, this might be a good time to mention that while an enormous amount of wealth and wealth of information and exciting finds are awaiting anyone who can find the time and the stamina to study the Talmud, one should only use it for the purpose of its historical content, helping to kind of understand the societal structure of the times, what their thought processes and agendas were, how they evolved, even how certain ceremonies occurred, what they represented, how they were performed. Sometimes the Talmud can help us put certain things from the Bible in proper chronological order. But what is there is not inspired of God. It is in no way on par with the Holy Scriptures. Yet it is not a pack of lies. It's not a bunch of inaccuracies either. Generally speaking, the writers and the commentators were the best and finest Jewish scholars and sages, historians of their day. But what is written can only be counted upon as earthly wisdom and knowledge, not of the Spirit. Unfortunately, the Jewish people have for thousands of years put the Talmud tradition on par with, sometimes even above, Holy Scripture. And Yeshua throttled and verbally scourged these academic elites of his day for doing that, even telling them that their so-called knowledge of godly matters was really from their true father, the devil. He was referring to the huge and growing body of tradition that was now dominating Jewish life. Now, one more thing about Issachar, and we'll move forward with the next son's blessing. Issachar being called an ass or a donkey sounds pretty demeaning to us. It could get you kicked out of class for saying it. Maybe smacked around a little bit for saying it to somebody you probably should have thought twice about. But this was not so to the ear of people of Jacob's day. This was not a derogatory remark. See, donkeys were valued creature. They were kind of a combination, of taxicabs in the trucking industry of that era. In sports today, we call an athlete a diesel, all right, short for diesel truck. And of course, it means an athlete that's powerful and single-minded and straightforward and no nonsense. Kind of the opposite of what you'd say is a finesse player. That guy's a diesel. Athletes that are referred to as diesels wear that title proudly. It would have been the same for Issachar being referred to as a strong donkey. Well, let's read a little bit more now. Open your Bibles back up to Genesis 49. Let's read verses 16 through 18. 16 through 18. Follow along with me. Dan will judge his people as one of the tribes of Israel. Dan will be a viper on the road, a horned snake in the path that bites the horse's heels so its rider falls off backwards. I wait for your deliverance, Adonai. We've now finished with the first group of 6 of Jacob's sons, all provided, by the way, up to this point, by his wife Leah. Now we see the blessings given to the 4 children of Jacob's concubines. These 4 were actually born after Leah produced Judah, but before she bore Issachar and Zebulun. These concubines are often referred to in the Bible as the handmaidens Zilpah and Bilhah, servants to Jacob's 2 wives, Leah and Rachel. Now, while among themselves we can be sure that the 12 sons of Jacob had established a pecking order, we can also be sure that the 4 sons born to the handmaidens were often pushed to the bottom of the totem pole. Other than for Jacob's unabashed favoritism towards his wife Rachel, and the 2 sons that she gave to him, which was Joseph and Benjamin, there's no indication that Jacob himself thought any less of these 4 sons produced by Zilpah and Bilhah than the other 8. But traditions of that era demanded that sons of concubines did not carry an equal status to the sons of a man's legal wives. Now, aware that his 12 sons were only 2 human, Jacob was probably concerned that those 4 sons not in any way be construed as second-class citizens among his sons. Now, this concern likely explains this kind of odd statement in verse 16 where Jacob says, Dan will judge his people as one of the tribes of Israel. Why would Jacob say he was one of the tribes of Israel? What else would he be? Well, while obvious to us that all 12 sons were legitimately of Israel, of Jacob, because Dan was one of these 4 sons of the concubines, not of his 2 wives, Jacob wanted to make it clear that they were all 12 part of Israel, one as much as the other. Well, Dan's name means judged, although Bilhah, Rachel's handmaiden, was Dan's biological mother. Rachel was her master, and she had the right to name that child. And Rachel exclaimed, God has judged me. And this happened when she couldn't produce a child of her own for Jacob, but her servant girl did. It was a great shame upon a woman who was unable to bear her husband's children, so this child was stuck with the name judged. Now, probably the most famous descendant of Dan was the supernaturally strong Samson. Samson was one of the 12 judges, in Hebrew, shoftim, mentioned in the Bible, that were raised up by God over about a 250-year period called the period of the Judges. That is, the time frame covered by the book of Judges in our Bibles was about 250 years. Judges appeared in many of the 12 tribes, not just in Dan. Now, Dan was given the unenviable territorial allotment that had them sharing a border with the fierce and seemingly unconquerable Philistines. Just a quick note about this, by the way. Hear this, please. The word Palestine, we know today, Palestine is simply the Greek word for Philistine. So when we talk about the Palestinians of the West Bank, or the creation of a Palestinian state, understand what we're saying is Philistines of the West Bank, And that we got most of the world that wants to create a Philistine state. Do you understand that? Now that might shake you up a tad to know that. Because prophetically speaking, the Bible tells us this exact thing is supposed to happen in the last days. The rebirth of the Philistine state is supposed to happen. How about that? Here's a little fun fact to go home and tell all your friends about. You'll have them run in the other direction. Samson was brought forth by God as a deliverer for the tribe of Dan from being oppressed by the Philistines, the Palestinians. Even though all the biblical judges, the Shoftim, were called by the same title, judge, Shofet, in fact, they performed different functions. Some were prophets, some were military leaders, some of them were rulers, some of them were deliverers, like Samson. Now, it's interesting to note that there is mention of a serpent in describing Dan's future characteristics. And while every tribe of Israel struggled with idolatry, sometimes giving in to Satan, perhaps none were as vexed by this particular problem as the tribe of Dan. Even the great judge Samson had a terrible time resisting the pagan influences of the Philistines, as we see in Scripture how he imbibed himself with prostitutes, loved to party with the pagans, had a fling with Delilah, and even married a Philistine girl. Many in the tribe of Dan, so wearied of battling the Philistines. I mean, think about what's happening today. Many of the tribe of Dan, so weary of battling the Palestinians, just keep those names back and forth because that's what we're talking about. They eventually gave up control over their land inheritance, and they moved out, and they moved northward to near the border of modern-day Lebanon. They conquered a city called Laish. They renamed it to Dan, and many of the tribe moved to that area. And by the way, the ruins, amazing ruins of this city is visible to this day. Many of you I've taken there, and will take several more this year. Well, immediately the leaders of Dan set up a carved image, an idol, and they assigned priests to it. And the city became a center of pagan cult worship, and it stayed that way for the next several centuries. Well, Dan's tribe diminished then over time in size and in importance. In fact, not only are they not even mentioned in the Old Testament listing of tribal genealogies of 1 Chronicles chapter 2, they are omitted in the New Testament listing of tribes that makes up that 144,000 sealed Israelite witnesses that we're told about in Revelation 7. If you look down the list, you won't see Dan's name. Does their being excluded in the tribal makeup of Revelation 7 mean that Dan is extinct for all time? Apparently not. Because in the millennial kingdom, the 1,000-year reign of Christ is described in Ezekiel chapter 48, Dan does receive an inheritance. And we need to remember that the timing of the 144,000 sealed Israelites takes place during what Christians call the tribulation period. This is what the Jews call the time of Jacob's troubles. And what's the alternative name for Jacob? Israel. The time of Israel's troubles. And the millennial kingdom then comes after that. So Dan is around during the tribulation, but he's possibly up to his old tricks. And there's not a single Danite worthy to be part of that 144,000 sealed witnesses. So I guess we're just going to have to kind of wait and see. Now let me show you something that I think answers some questions, at least, about Dan. I told you Dan means judge, or more accurately, judged. at least as we think of it in our modern English language. That's the word that comes closest. As I've often explained, Hebrew is what's called a root word language. You take a word, it has a specific meaning, you add, subtract, or change a letter or two. Usually what is being changed are the vowel sounds. And presto, you have a new word. But that new word is always related in meaning to the original root word. For instance, in Genesis 15:14, God says, "But I will also judge that nation whom they serve." The Hebrew word used for judge in this verse is din, D-I-N, din. Notice the relationship to the word dan, D-A-N. In between the letters dalet and nun, the D and the N, only the vowel sound is changed. So the two words, by the way Hebrew works, are related. The point is that din and dan both carry the same idea of judging or judgment. That is, a retaliation, a punishment, a penalty. This as opposed to another entirely different use in the English language of the word judge, as we often find in the books of the Bible called Judges, shoftim. Shofet, shoftim, shofet, means a person who's a magistrate. It's usually a person who makes legal rulings, is a leader, a decision maker. A good analogy is our modern American legal system, where we have a judge presiding over a court of law. So here we have two words, dan and shofet, that both wind up being translated into the English word judge, but they have two completely unrelated meanings in Hebrew. Point being that the name Dan does not indicate a person who presides over a court. This is not a person who makes legal rulings. This is not a person who leads. Dan indicates someone receiving a divine judgment against them. And of course, that was the sense of the word that Rachel used to name this child, Dan, born by her handmaiden, Bilhah, because Rachel felt that the reason her own womb had dried up was because, why? God had judged her, judged against her, was punishing her. So, as was tradition, she named her child after some event, some circumstance that surrounded that particular child's birth, and she came up with Dan, judged. Here we also have this son named Judged, with Dan having all sorts of calamitous things happening to it, even being omitted from the list of tribes in Revelation 7. And so Dan's destiny was completely reflected in his name. Now, verse 18 of chapter 49 has Jacob suddenly saying, "Oh, I wait for your deliverance, Adonai," or Lord. What it really says there is, "I wait for your salvation, Yehovah," or Yahweh, depending on how you want to pronounce it. It actually says, "I wait for your salvation," and then it has the Hebrew tetragrammaton, Yud He Vav He, the Hebrew letters there. Now, it's unknown whether this statement was meant to be attached to the blessing of Dan, or that Jacob, in a moment of ecstasy, knowing that his time was just literally moments away, shouted this out to the Lord almost in a final moment of praise. Now, some think that the mention in the previous couple of verses concerning the serpent that bites the heel is a reminder of the scene back in Genesis 3:15 about how the woman will produce a seed that will crush the head of the serpent, Satan, and the serpent will bruise the heel of the seed. All of this an obvious messianic reference. If that's the case, then Jacob shouting out, "I wait for my Savior," is all the more meaningful. But it really isn't clear enough for me to say for sure that that's what's happening here. I don't want to allegorize it and twist it around to make it appear stronger than it is. So I guess that's just another thing we're going to have to wonder about. Anyway, let's move on now to Genesis 49:19. Genesis 49:19. Very brief. Gad, a troop will troop on him, but he will troop on their heel. Everybody got that? The tribe of Gad, another of the children of Jacob's 2 concubines, was up. And his blessing is very short, about a dozen words or so in length. Basically, it says Gad is going to become constantly oppressed and under attack. But in the end, Gad will overcome it. If we look at the territory that Gad was eventually given, we see that Gad will be one of the tribes that, like Reuben, decided not to enter into the promised land. Instead, Gad's descendants settled to the east side of the Jordan River. His borders were exposed to several longtime enemies, including the Moabites and the Ammonites, who were descendants of Lot. And much like Dan, the tribe of Gad found themselves constantly at war. On the other hand, this constant warfare led to Gad becoming regarded as the fiercest of warriors, very capable fighters. Now, interestingly, Gad is not credited in the Bible with any particular outstanding person belonging to that tribe. Now, Elijah, the prophet Elijah, by tradition is said to be a Gadite, but that is strictly legend. It's never been verified. The most famous person was probably Yair, who was a shofet, a judge, over Gad for a time. In the Old Testament, we will occasionally, by the way, run into the geographical name of Gilead, the land of Gilead. Gilead and Gad and the land of Gad are generally all used interchangeably to describe where the tribe of Gad settled, and that was on the east side of the Jordan River. Now let's go to Genesis 49:20 and another blessing. Asher's food is rich. He will provide food fit for a king. Naphtali, that's right, we're just going to do one, aren't we? We'll just do this first one. Once again. Asher's food is rich. He will provide food fit for a king. We'll get to Naphtali in a minute. Asher is the third of Jacob's concubines' 4 sons. And once again, we can't help but notice how short and succinct this blessing is that's given to him. Asher means happy. And certainly the blessing that Jacob gave to Asher and his descendants was one of well-being, if not downright good fortune. Asher's portion of land was some of the most fertile in all the Holy Land, stretching between the land of Tyre on Mount Carmel. Their corn, their olive oil was famous for its quality and its quantity. Apparently, Asher shunned, somehow they got out of military conflicts. They chose a very peaceful life and society of agriculture. Consequently, we just don't read of any great military commander or leader, not even a judge, coming from Asher. Now, verse 21, and Naphtali now. Naphtali is a doe set free that bears beautiful fawns. Now, Naphtali is the last of the 4 sons of Jacob's wives' handmaidens. And true to form, Naphtali is given a very abbreviated blessing. Naphtali is told his descendants will be as a hind, H-I-N-D, a hind set loose. A hind is a female deer, a doe. And we find many passages throughout the Bible that make references to a hind, always, by the way, in a very favorable light. Now, we're told in this single verse that Naphtali is destined to be of graceful beauty, swift, quick to react. And when we look at Naphtali in times after they've entered into the promised land and settled, we find the most prominent mention of that tribe in Judges chapter 5, in the song of Deborah and Barak, where Barak and his tribe of Naphtali are singled out for the special acts of bravery in a significant military conflict between the Israelites and some other Canaanite tribes. For me, though, most significant is an unprecedented honor that the tribe of Naphtali received, because it was in Naphtali's territory, now part of the Galilee, that Yeshua recruited the most of his disciples and then began his ministry. Interestingly, the prophet Isaiah, in chapter 9, verse 1, prophesied that the insignificant territory of Naphtali would be seen as receiving a great light. And of course, Isaiah 9 is one of the great prophecies concerning the coming of the Messiah. So Naphtali was greatly blessed, even if not one other thing of importance could even be said about this tribe. Well, 10 down, 10 tribes down, we got 2 to go. Up next is Joseph. Let's get back to our Bibles. We're going to read Genesis 49, verses 22 through 26. Now, Joseph is a fruitful plant by a spring, with branches climbing over the wall. The archers attack him fiercely, shooting at him, pressing him hard, but his bow remains taut, and his arms made nimble by the hands of the mighty one of Jacob. And from there, from the shepherd, the stone of Israel, by the God of your father who will help you, by El Shaddai who will bless you with blessings from heaven above, blessings from the deep lying below, blessings from the breasts and the womb. The blessings of your father are more powerful than the blessings of my parents, extending to the farthest of the everlasting hills. They will be on the head of Joseph, on the brow of the prince among his brothers. One can only imagine, I believe, Jacob's anticipation of getting around to the official blessing of his most favored son. One can probably also imagine Joseph's 11 brothers bracing themselves because they knew what was coming. Praise heaped upon praise, blessing heaped upon blessing. The double portion going to Joseph seemed to them to be the double of theirs at the least. But let us remember a very important factor in this blessing of Joseph. While it would be in the name of Joseph, it would come about under the tribal authority of Ephraim and to a lesser degree Manasseh. For all practical purposes, once Joseph's 2 sons reached maturity, married, had children of their own, there would be no more tribal name of Joseph, just Ephraim and Manasseh, his sons. Joseph would just be a memory. As we can recall from Genesis 48, it was Ephraim to whom all the rights and honors of Joseph would accumulate, because Jacob also gave Ephraim the firstborn blessing, even though Manasseh would also prosper in his own right. Now let me say that again. Remember when Jacob gave Joseph that firstborn blessing, he did it in the form of naming Ephraim and Manasseh to supersede Joseph, their father. And further, he pronounced that Ephraim, who was the younger, was to be considered the firstborn. Joseph did not get the honor that a father typically gives, did not get the honor, it says again, Joseph, not Jacob, Joseph did not get the honor that a father typically gets to pronounce the firstborn blessing upon his own children. Because at the moment of that cross-handed blessing, Jacob became the adoptive father of Joseph's 2 boys. Joseph was their biological father, but that's where it ended. Jacob was now the official father of those 2 boys, who were his grandsons. They became his children. Perhaps the overriding theme of this blessing upon Joseph, which is to be carried forward primarily under the banner of Ephraim, is fruitfulness. Fruitfulness. This fruitfulness is not only told of Joseph's personal life, it also tells of his descendants' prophetic destiny. Yet this fruitfulness is going to came and is going to come at a very high cost. Joseph endured an awful lot in his life. A lot. His fruitfulness was not a result of his cleverness or of just good fortune or having things just kind of handed to him. His fruitfulness was the result of his faithfulness. And his faithfulness was a result of his absolute, unswavering trust in God. I wonder how many of us could have endured all those years in prison under false charges, let alone enduring rejection by our family the way Joseph was, and then forgiving it all. Not only forgiving, but then he blessed those who had done him such incredible, pitiless, merciless wrongs. And beyond even that, having such a sustaining faith that he refused all bitterness, because he knew without a doubt this had all been part of God's plan, all part of his plan for his life. Even if as it happened, it absolutely made no sense, it was so painful. Maybe to those who run the good race in their lives, clinging to our faith no matter the circumstances, these words of Jacob reveal God's heart towards them, towards us. Blessing upon more blessing. Historically speaking, the fruitfulness of Ephraim and Manasseh was very apparent. Manasseh received the largest of all the territorial allotments, spanning both the east and the west banks of the Jordan River. In the first chapter of the book of Numbers, we see that together the tribes of Ephraim and Manasseh, in other words, together they form what the Bible would call the whole tribe of Joseph, was the largest at 75,900 men. Now, not surprisingly, the tribe who received the other half of that split firstborn blessing, which was Judah, was second largest at 74,600. Yet by the time of the census of Numbers chapter 26, something about 40 or so years later, Judah's population had only grown marginally to about 76,500. But the combined populations of Ephraim and Manasseh, they jumped to 85,200 according to the census. Fruitfulness was promised to Joseph. Fruitfulness is what he got. Well, as we are only now, within the last decade or so, beginning to understand, Ephraim's fruitfulness may have grown to proportions that are staggering. Remember that it was Ephraim who eventually dominated and absorbed every tribe of Israel except for Judah and Benjamin. Further, when that one huge super tribe named Ephraim that was made up from the 10 tribes was overcome by the Assyrians and scattered throughout the known world, the known Gentile world, most of Ephraim melded their genes with the genes of the Gentiles. But as we've recently discovered, the tribes of Ephraim who retained their identity throughout the centuries, but live in isolated areas of the world, also number in the millions. Who among us in this world has the genes of the tribes forming Ephraim in them? We don't know. But one could guess that it's in the hundreds of millions. Fruitfulness fulfilled. That in itself is another fulfillment then of Genesis 48, verse 19. Ephraim's descendants, will become the fullness of who? The Gentile nations. That was the prophecy. This has literally happened. The one thing that's not completely clear, though, is getting clearer. It is the precise way that the matter of this split blessing going to Ephraim is going to fully manifest itself. Will this be a strictly physical matter, in other words, genealogical, that those Gentiles who biologically but unknowingly possess Ephraim's genes in their bodies are in for a significant blessing? Or will it be a strictly spiritual matter, that God's blessing upon the Gentile world was predicated upon those who have benefited from identifying with Ephraim Israel? That is, that we Gentile believers identify spiritually with Israel, as Paul instructs us to do, by the way, in Romans chapter 11? Or could it possibly be some combination of the physical and the spiritual? Don't know. What we need to take away from all this is that all believers in Messiah Yeshua are destined to identify with Israel. And Ephraim sits smack in the middle of making this identity real and not just philosophical in some way. Ephraim is like this magnificent bridge that organically and spiritually connects the world of the Jews with the world of the Gentiles. Next week, we're going to look at the last tribe of the blessing of Genesis 49, which is Benjamin. Then we'll fittingly get into the last chapter of the book of Genesis, chapter 50. In fact, next week ends our study of the book of Genesis. So 2 weeks from today, we will begin the first chapter of Exodus.